Okay, 5:30. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Welcome everyone to this Fabian session looking at the war in Ukraine. Special welcome to Professor Rob Rebel. He's got up very early this morning. He's in Warsaw and he's joining us from Warsaw, from Poland. So what does the Russian invasion mean for Ukraine, for Europe and for faraway New Zealand? Is it the end of the rules-based international order? Are we heading back to the days not just of the Cold War, but of hot wars? Does the New Zealand response match up to our reputation as a defender of human rights? There's, of course, many more questions. The role of NATO in the lead up to the war, the role of information and disinformation, and longer term impacts on global food supply. So feed in your questions to the chat. Each of our three panelists is going to speak for up to 10 minutes. Then we'll get a conversation going based around some of the questions. First up is Professor Natalia Chaban from Canterbury University. She has a personal stake in what's happening. Her parents have just left their home and their jobs in Ukraine. Natalia was on Google Maps the other day with a phone in her hand, guiding them as they drove to the Polish border. Natalia has been a visiting professor in Lithuania and Ukraine, and her PhD is from Kyiv National Linguistic University. Her research interests include political communication, public diplomacy, and EU foreign policy. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Good evening, everyone. Kia ora, my fellow co-panelists. And when we were talking with Philip how we can discuss the war in Ukraine, I proposed a topic about information flows around the war. And I would like to stop at three key points. First, I would like to talk about information flows on a global scale, maybe a little bit zooming into New Zealand. Then I will comment on information flows in Ukraine and information flows in Russia, and I'm happy to take your questions. So when I thought how to start my presentation, I thought that I actually realized that when I wake up and I read the news, and I read news now obsessively, I read them non-stop, I read every minute I have, I actually get more upset if I start reading the news starting with The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post than if I start reading news from Ukrainian sources. And this is and I realized why. I think Ukrainian sources at the moment are reporting a lot of micro news. That's how I call them. They report a lot about this village has been freed, the pensions have been paid, the firefighters put the fire down in one of the houses which was bombarded during the night time. And so these news, they're not very positive because, of course, lots of these things are happening because of the war, but they show that on a very simple level, everyday level of everyday people, there is a lot of constructive work is done, that Ukraine is a viable state, that it takes care of its businesses, its elderly, its young. The latest news is that people who are internally displaced people, they will get some help from the state, that families who are helping them, they will have help from the state, and children who are displaced internally will have help from the state. While the global media seems to be concentrating on big, very negative, very dramatic, very tragic events. And on one side, this is very important. Ukraine has remained a terra incognita for a long time. Even the dramatic news about the Crimea annexation, about MH17 or 8-year-long war in Donbass, they sort of made some splash. But then Ukraine, after 2014, has just disappeared from the radars of the global media. And while 12,000 people died in the 8 years of non-stop war actions in the east of Ukraine, unfortunately, it didn't attract that much. So I think it's good, the visibility, the salience is there. On the other side, I think global audience may overlook a lot of these everyday heroism, but also the sort of activities of the Ukrainian state that is not only under attack, but actually is trying to do something for its citizens, in a constructive and positive manner. And since we here in Christchurch, we survived the earthquake, we know how important it is to give visibility to those everyday heroes, the firemen, the people who go into the collapsed buildings and pull out people out of that. In all the pictures, I'm sure you see firemen in special vests and they are going into there. So I thought I might attract your attention to that sort of interesting dynamic going on. And of course, the New Zealand media have been quite focused on New Zealand response to the war. And we all know about very generous humanitarian aid, an unprecedented move towards the sanctions and Sanctions Act, and of course, a special policy on refugees in New Zealand. My second circle, I'll mention very briefly, it's about information flows in Ukraine. According to the Washington Post, Ukraine is winning the information war over Russia. And several international media, CNN, The Guardian, also published articles which were analyzing where Ukraine is stronger than the Russian Federation in projecting itself to the world. A special place belongs, of course, to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm sure you've been following his virtual diplomatic tour, how he presented to Parliament in Canada, Congress in the United States, Knesset in Israel, Bundestag in Germany, and in every of these addresses, he came with formulations and appeals that have grounds in local narratives, with references to self-perceptions of this particular nation, traumatic junctures in their history. He speaks without a piece of paper. He's a good presenter. Every parliament gives him standing ovations. But it's not only that virtual tour. Think about how he gives interviews to international media. He typically sits on the steps of his administration wearing this khaki colored t-shirt, very informal, but he never sort of towers above the journalist. He's speaking in a dialogue without a piece of paper, in an open conversation. And these images are circulating around the world. It's not only President Zelensky, he is also surrounded by some quite talented communicators. Mikhailo Podolyak, who is the head of negotiation team, Aristovich, who is one of the everyday speakers. In a different presentation, I called him a Ukrainian Ashley Bloomfield. Aristovich is a psychologist. When he comes, he speaks in a very calm, very soothing voice, even when he talks about dramatic or sometimes tragic events. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kuleba, who is a seasoned diplomat and was awarded the Best Diplomat of 2017 award. But if you look into their backgrounds and you see who they were in the peaceful life before they came as speakers for Ukraine in different contexts, and again, these are people speaking without a piece of paper. They're excellent communicators. They're cracking jokes when appropriate. They are admired by all social media commentators either. So if you look at their backgrounds, they all have backgrounds in strategic communication, journalism, blogging, and Kuleba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, his career started actually with public diplomacy and strategic communication within diplomacy. So they're actually professionals in the field. Finally, in Ukraine, because of the internet still being available on all different social media channels, YouTube, Instagram, list goes on and on, there is a number of commentators who have very big followerships, and they all comment either on military aspects or social aspects or international aspects. But what is important, that the information released from the Ukrainian side is resonating against each other. And whoever those commentators, they really don't contradict each other, which we cannot say about the Russian side. If you remember fiasco with Lavrov saying, yes, we did bomb the maternity house. Then the Ministry of Defense says, no, we didn't bomb the maternity house. And then Lavrov comes back, so no, we didn't bomb the maternity house. And actually, we haven't attacked anyone, if we think about that. So this it's a very brief overview of Ukrainian video side. As you know, television towers have been among the first bombed by the Russian Federation. Elon Musk provided the satellites. At the moment, specifically internet and social media are functioning on many different levels. It is about providing information. Today, the subway will work in Kyiv. Tomorrow, it will not work. It is about providing education, how to cook, or if you are in a besieged city and your child is sick, you go online and you talk to a doctor who can provide information. It is also about propaganda. We cannot deny war times. One of the strongest propaganda tools was videos showing the press conferences with the captured soldiers. You can talk about information, how to secure better defense of your country. For example, there are often calls, please don't make any videos with your phones and don't post them online. This will direct the enemy in shootings. And people listen. My parents, when they were moving to Poland, they turned off their GPS because the government requested to turn off GPS because Google Maps was showing where there's a congestion of cars and they could be bombed. And of course, there are solars. I'm talking about some memes and some interesting videos, like a peasant hooking with his tractor at a tank and trying to use it to plow the field. In a very brief final part, I will start addressing Russia, but I'm happy to address more of Russian communication flows in your question and answer. I think we all agree that it's an unprecedented move for a state in the 21st century to close internet space, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now they're threatening to close YouTube. It's also an unprecedented role of television. For a long time, we've been told that TV is dead as mass media because of internet. But in Russia, things seem to be developing somehow differently. And still, we're talking about the zombie box. But what is interesting, nothing is black and white. And Russian media space has enough of nuances to talk about federal channels where people are coming with posters behind. We know Marina Ovsyannikova. At the same time, her act triggers massive resignation of professionals from federal channels. But at the same time, lots of people from provinces are now coming to Moscow. There's always somebody to come and work. Just yesterday, Komsomolskaya Pravda, Komsomol Truth, which is the super pro-Putin newspaper, by mistake, publishes the number of dead soldiers and saying, no, Ukrainian statistics is wrong. According to the Ministry of Defense, the number of killed soldiers is 9,000 and something. Is it a leak? Is it an act of civil bravery? Or is it absolute unprofessional act where people don't think what they are doing? Question mark, question mark, question mark. And I probably will finish that while we, of course, can talk about information flows, something to watch is, of course, the impact of sanctions. And some commentators are talking we will have a battle of TV versus fridge. When the fridge becomes empty, what is on TV doesn't matter. I'll stop here. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks very much, Natalia. I think there'll be some questions coming up from that, but let's hear first from Rob, and Rob is on the ground in Poland, right next door where the refugees are flowing through. So Rob, can you give us an update on how things look from Warsaw? And Rob, I should say, is a professorial fellow at the Centre for Strategic Studies, and right now he's a visiting professor at Warsaw. But Rob, thanks very much for getting up early in the morning. Tell us how it looks from inside Poland.
Thanks, Philip, and Tena kouta katoa, and good morning, and dzień dobry from Poland. As Philip said, it's very, very early here, but it's great to be able to join my fellow panelists and to engage with all of you in the audience this morning and this early evening in New Zealand. There's a famous quote that is purported to be from Vladimir Lenin that says, there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. And I've been using that quote quite often in discussions that I've had on Ukraine in Zoom sessions of various sorts, both with the Polish Association in New Zealand, for example, and with a big session we had from here with my colleagues, who included Ukrainians and Polish speakers, with Taiwan, which is a country that is taking a particular interest in our region on what is happening in this region here in Europe. And what I'd like to do is focus primarily on the view from Poland, but I began with that quote because, of course, there are so many things that can be said about these dramatic few weeks and what they mean for this part of the world, not just Ukraine, but for Europe and for the world as a whole. And I think we can pick that up in the questions, but I'll focus mainly on Poland. But before I do that, I did want to say something to add to that excellent discussion of information flows that we had from Natalia. And that is, this morning I've got an op-ed out on Stuff about the importance of distinguishing between Vladimir Putin and the Russian people. And one of the points that I make there is the crucial importance of maintaining information flows within Russia to the extent that it is possible, and to try and use the power of transparency to try and break down that iron wall of censorship that Vladimir Putin is trying to impose within Russia. But let me turn, again, I'm sure there'll be more discussion of information flows based on what Natalia has said. But let me turn to just say a few things about the view from Poland here. I'd say that the first thing I would note is that I think there's a real sense within Poland that this is Poland's hour, and that it's a moment for many Poles to be very proud of being Polish and of standing in solidarity with Ukraine. When you go around the city, there is blue and yellow everywhere. The buses have Ukrainian flags on them. There are posters. Just the other day, I took a photo of a big sign on a building that said "Poland stands with Ukraine." And I think there's no doubt that hearts and homes have been opened to Ukrainians displaced from the war. As you will all know, the majority, well, the largest group of Ukrainians who have left the country have moved into or through Poland, well in excess of 1 million Ukrainians. And although life is very much normal here in Poland, it's very difficult to avoid knowing and having some indirect contact with someone who is doing something about the situation in Ukraine. I had an earlier opinion piece in which I mentioned the former Polish ambassador to New Zealand, Zbigniew Miakowski, who has an apartment just 2 buildings down from the street that I'm living on currently. And about 2 weeks ago, I helped him move some furniture into that apartment because he's given the apartment to a Ukrainian mother and her three children. I have a colleague who has done something similar for his cleaners' relatives, because there are so many Ukrainians here already. There were 1 million Ukrainians, more than 1 million Ukrainians living in Poland before the war. And so everyone here has someone who knows a Ukrainian. And my students, one of my students missed class because she was taking an elderly Ukrainian woman to have a vaccination yesterday. Another student is organizing the Students' Association response to try and assist displaced Ukrainians. We have 2 Ukrainian lecturers who have been supported by the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies, where I'm based. So everywhere you find someone you know who is doing something to try and assist Ukrainians who are coming into Poland, or assisting out in other ways as well. I might add a few other points about Poland. Some of you may know that Poland is a pretty politically polarized society. There are deep political divisions in this country. Warsaw is a city where about 70% of the people here voted against the current president, for example, although 70% in the countryside voted for him and his party in the last presidential election, which took place 2 years ago when I was here. But despite that political polarization, Poles are very much united in response to the Ukraine crisis. In part because it involves a neighbor which Poland has had a complicated history with, and I think Natalia would know something of that on both sides. But those political divisions that dominate domestic politics here seem to have been set aside and forgotten during this period. And I think that's in part a reflection of the fact that there is a great consciousness that Poland is a frontline state in what has happened with respect to Ukraine. It's not just important as a country which is receiving so many displaced Ukrainians. It's also important as a country where much of the material support from other parts of the world are flowing. So just as Ukrainians flow in families, women and children are flowing in one direction, so weapons and supplies are flowing in the other direction. So there's a real sense within Poland that Poland is in the front line of what many see as this battle that involves not only Ukraine, but is in effect a battle in part of a new Cold War. And there's a real consciousness of that here in Poland. And I think the other aspect of being a frontline state, and especially when I talk to colleagues and friends, is that Poland, most Poles I speak to have the view that it's good to see what is being done. It's important to have the humanitarian support. It's important to keep those military supplies flowing to Ukraine, but that even more should be done. There's a strong view within Poland, expressed by its government, that Ukraine should be admitted into the EU as quickly as possible, for example. And the Polish government, and I think with the support of most Poles, want to see as strong a response as possible. They have the view that you need to have kind of Poles to stiffen the spine of some of the other members of the EU and NATO. And I think the fact that Poland is a frontline state also is indicated by the number of high-level visitors that have come through this city and the number of convoys that you have with screaming sirens, with someone very important in that convoy of vehicles here. So in the past few weeks, Boris Johnson has been here, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, Kamala Harris, and Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. And at the end of this week, Joe Biden will be here. And so I think there is a real sense within NATO ranks and within the EU that Poland is playing a pivotal role. And as I said at the outset, the sense within the country that in many ways this is Poland's hour. And with that sense comes many memories of what Poland has suffered in the past. Particularly during World War II, my own father fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and the number of people who look at the scenes, those some aspects of those dramatic scenes that the global media are showing, the very bleak and dismal scenes that Natalia mentioned feature in global media. When people in this city look at that, they think back to what happened to this city in 1944 as a result of the uprising and the subsequent Nazi response, in which more than 160,000 people died, most of them civilians murdered by the Nazis, and the city razed to the ground afterwards. And those memories hang heavy over the Polish collective memory. And so they look at Ukraine and they find it hard to believe that memories from that era are being lived out in their television screens and other forms of media today in the 21st century. So I think that's probably all I really want to say about the Polish perspective, because I think there'll be time to pick up on other angles during the question time. But one final point I would just add is that certainly Poles are trying to be part of that information war as well. And if you're interested, I would suggest that you might, and I also mentioned that Poles have set aside their domestic political divisions for the moment. There is a former Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, who is the scourge of the current government. He's a member of the European Parliament now. He was also a former defense minister. He's the scourge of the current government in many ways on domestic issues. However, he is also perhaps even more assertive than the government in criticizing Russia in very, very firm and often witty ways. You might want to look at him on Twitter, and he is often engaging and pointing out things like he spars with some Russian ambassadors and asks them why they are on Twitter when Twitter is banned in their country, for example. His wife is also someone very well known, Anne Applebaum, who is a leading journalist who has written a book on the famine in Ukraine and won a Pulitzer Prize for her work, including also on the gulags. And she is also very active in the information sphere. She writes for The Atlantic. But if you're interested, it's well worth looking at what those two are doing. And they're both, of course, based in Poland. I'll leave it at that, Philip, and happy to engage further during the question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Rob. That's tremendous. And yes, do enter any questions you've got in the chat and we'll work our way through. Our third speaker tonight is Jim Headley. He's Associate Professor at Otago University, and his research interests are Russian foreign policy, the EU, nationalism, ethnic conflict, and international relations theory. And he's the author of Russia and the Balkans, Foreign Policy from Yeltsin to Putin. So Jim, can you give us something of the bigger picture? Over to you.
Kia ora koutou, and I really found it fascinating, the first two presentations, and thanks, Philip, for inviting me. So yeah, I'm picking up, I suppose, on the bigger picture, which Rob kind of touched on and said we can talk about them. And like him, I've taken part in several panels, one of them fairly early on, and it was so overwhelming, it still is. But we're nearly a month into this war, so some of the things we can begin to kind of reflect on, but there are so many uncertainties about where it's going to go and why it got to this and so on. So I'll look at some of these bigger questions and kind of pan out a bit from initially to Europe and then out from Europe. So the first bit I want to talk about is just why this is such a big deal. Given the massive buildup of troops leading up to it, and which creates its own momentum, the full-scale invasion perhaps shouldn't have been such a surprise, but I think in all of us it created real shock. And the scale and implications of it go beyond any of Putin's previous wars or violations of international law. I suppose part of the element of surprise for kind of Russia observers was that in many ways Putin has often been pragmatic and cautious, opportunistic, as with Crimea. And taking a look at this, it's right from the start, it's been very hard to see how in the long term this could be in Russia's interest. Even in the short term, Putin, because of the reaction, because of the response, Putin's managed to kind of plunge Russia back into the economic situation it was in the 1990s, which he took such kind of pride in having kind of rescued it from. And I think we can't ignore ideology in his worldview as it now exists in shaping this decision, and the fact that he's been in power too long and various aspects of that, one of which I think is that he almost sees himself as embodying Russia. So any slight to him is a slight to Russia and vice versa. Maybe he didn't expect the level of Ukrainian resistance, but he should have done, but then maybe he believes his own narrative about what the Ukrainian nation is, or the strong united response from the West. And I've been impressed by the latter, but not really surprised, because, and again, it comes back to the point that this is of such a different magnitude and such a major threat. First of all, it's partly the way it's been conducted, the massive bombardments, the full-scale invasion. What Rob was talking about, the response of people seeing it on television. My mother-in-law, who is Greek, was born 1941. Her father died on the front as Italy invaded. And she said to my wife that she's in Greece, she can't watch the TV, she can't talk about it, because it brings back memories of what her mum had said about the conditions there in Greece and particularly the plight of children. It's the fact that it's such a full-on violation of the UN Charter with no legitimate cause. And in the lead up to the invasion, I refused to call it a crisis, as people did, because there was no legitimate reason to call it a crisis. It was created purely by Putin. And I'd like to just quote the preamble of the UN General Assembly resolution, which condemned Russia's aggression, and it recalled, and I'm quoting, the obligation of all states under Article 2 of the UN Charter to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, and to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. So, I mean, there's no clearer statement of how much this goes against, the actions go against this founding part of the UN Charter. Looking at the European context, Putin might have expected divisions or weaknesses, but in fact that hasn't materialized, and even Orban's Hungary has kind of come out with the general EU line, even Switzerland to a certain extent. Instead, in many ways, it's pushed the EU towards more unity and more talk of becoming a geopolitical actor, including increased military spending and coordination. But that doesn't mean that it's driven a wedge between the EU and NATO. The NATO response is also united, although there may be some differences in views on strategy and what to do about supply of weapons and so on. But it's interesting today with the launching of what's called the Strategic Compass for Security and Defense. Josep Borrell said NATO is still the cornerstone of the territorial defense of Europe, and that they're not going to create a European army. Now, there is potential for divisions over wider trade, sanctions, and especially over oil and gas. And again, that's in the news today. But so far, it's been united. But as I say, I'm not surprised by it because of what a flagrant abuse this is and the way the war's been conducted and so on. So what does that mean for the wider implications of the rules-based international order, which was part of the kind of description of this panel? So I've participated in or watched 4 panels on the war in Ukraine so far, before this one. And in 3 of them, at least one of the panelists gave the Mearsheimer realist line, which also overlaps with the leftist anti-US or NATO line, ultimately claiming that NATO is equally or even more to blame than Russia. I strongly disagree with it. I myself didn't support NATO enlargement, but I understood the push for membership in the region. But NATO does not pose a threat to Russia. Ukraine was not about to join NATO, but you can see why the leaders wanted to join NATO. And this is where I draw on my own research, NATO didn't just enlarge, but it found a new role in the post-Cold War era. So much of what I looked at in tensions over policy towards the Yugoslav conflicts was about NATO's role there. And part of it was NATO kind of finding this new role out of area. And Russia's response was about trying to prevent NATO finding that new role. That meant blocking action, including in the Security Council, which NATO might take to enforce UN resolutions, such as protecting the safe areas, such as Srebrenica. And it was only, I suppose, when the Srebrenica massacre happened that NATO did finally act against the Bosnian Serbs without a UN mandate. And then later, of course, we had Kosovo. And the Kosovo war, NATO's conducting of it, included airstrikes and cruise missile strikes and so on, including on targets such as the TV tower in Belgrade. And I have this book here, Wesley Clark's Waging Modern War, which kind of is his defense of that. But that's part of a kind of background problem, I think. That kind of way of waging war kind of set a precedent, I suppose. But there's no doubt also that it broke international law, and the subsequent recognitions of Kosovo also undermined the principle of territorial integrity. Now, as I say, none of this kind of means that NATO is a threat to Russia, and we saw with Chechnya that NATO didn't act in the same sort of way. But those of us studying this, even if we supported NATO action as I did, realized that it did pose a threat to the rules-based international order in the eyes of Russia and in the eyes of the wider world, including China. And that, of course, raised questions around how you respond to a humanitarian catastrophe, genocide, and so on, where the UN Security Council is blocked, how you go about deciding it, and who decides. Now, of course, the same applied, some of the issues that arose applied much more with the war in Iraq, which, of course, was a full-on invasion of the sovereign state under false pretext. So none of this is in any way to give credence to Russian claims or those who blame this war on Ukraine on the West and NATO. But I think it does make it harder, especially for states that supported the Iraq war, to talk of Russia's violation of the rules-based international system, which brings me to the New Zealand context. I think New Zealand is in a stronger position because of its very strong commitment to the UN system, which explains partly the reluctance to impose autonomous sanctions, and of course oppose the Iraq war. What this means is that potentially New Zealand could play a kind of bigger role in diplomacy, although it is, of course, a very insignificant actor. Now, perhaps within New Zealand or within our wider region, some may claim that this is a European problem and New Zealand shouldn't automatically fall in line with the West and particularly NATO. But besides the arguments about the attack on the UN Charter, this war will affect the whole globe. The economic impact of sanctions globally, rise in energy prices, the impact on food supplies, including to vulnerable countries, which Patrick mentioned at the start. Unfortunately, New Zealand's and the wider West perception of the war as Russian aggression isn't necessarily shared among non-European states, as shown by the voting in the UN General Assembly on that resolution. And we can interpret this in both ways. Overall, nearly 3/4 of the UN member states voted in favor of that resolution condemning Russia. A minuscule percentage voted against, and just under 1/5, 20%, abstained. But I still find it disappointing that such a clear violation of the UN Charter was not condemned outright by a number of states in Latin America, Africa, and the Asia Pacific. Those that we might actually think of as benefiting from principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression. In the Indo-Pacific or Asia Pacific, in addition to China, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh all abstained on that resolution. Now, obviously, there's geopolitical reasons. But I think it's partly something I've read a little bit about, the sort of idea in the global south of not getting drawn into another European caused world war. And I think a bit of enjoying some Western comeuppance. Encouragingly, though, from the New Zealand perspective, all Pacific Islands Forum countries voted in favour, and Secretary General Henry Puna issued a statement on the 26th of February condemning it in terms of this violation of the UN Charter and the importance for small states of international law. And that was followed up by a Pacific Islands Forum statement at the UN, which said similar kind of things. I just want to finish with just some thoughts or maybe advice about what it means for the political left. First of all, I'd say don't just side with those who oppose the US and NATO. Again, Sophia's brother in Greece was saying in Greece, it's the kind of far right and the far left who are kind of supporting Russia. And that doesn't surprise me. We'll see that in other countries in Europe as well, I think. There was an interesting piece in The Guardian on Sunday, or The Observer, I suppose, 5 people giving their consideration about how to respond, how to deal with a person like Putin. And Catriona Kelly, who is a historian of Russia, made a point and put a link to Taras Bilus's letter to the Western left from Kyiv, which is very interesting. And it's a kind of response to that leftish automatic kind of anti-Westernism, which then sides with people like Putin. Deal with the issue as it is, don't engage in whataboutisms. Don't always perceive it through the lens of political issues at home. And an example, I get the London Review of Books, as maybe some of you do. And one of the readers I'm always interested in, Jacqueline Rose, contributed to the latest edition, which is online at the moment, a number of contributors reflecting on Ukraine. And she began her piece, "There is something disquieting about the ease with which the label fascist is being used with reference to Putin's Russia, Putin's monstrous new fascism, our fight against Putin's fascism. It's not that his autocracy, etc., doesn't merit it, but rather the looseness of the term, the way it lets other nations boasting their democratic freedoms off the hook." And then she talks about Boris Johnson, his proroguing of parliament, the police crime sentencing and courts bill. Now, to me, it's disquieting to rule out talking about Russia as fascist, either in the name of that we should kind of use it, that Russia doesn't yet qualify, or that because of some things that democracies are doing, then they too are maybe on the verge of fascism. You may have seen my piece in Newsroom where they put the title of it, Russia is now a fascist state. And although that wasn't my title, that was the finishing kind of remarks I made. And I think if we refuse to call it that, I don't think the label particularly matters, but the features that go into that are important. If we don't recognize that, we fail to understand part of the dynamics of the conflict and also some of the challenges of trying to deal with a post-Putin Russia. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. That's great. I wonder if we could just go back to you, Natalia, to just talk to us a little bit about any legitimacy in the claim that Ukraine belongs in Russia or is part of Russia. Could you talk to us a little bit about the history?
Thank you, Philip. As history of any place is a very complex and a convoluted subject to talk, I cannot claim that I will tell you the history of Ukraine starting from the medieval times. And already, Rob, in your presentation, you alluded to some historical rifts between Ukraine and Poland, and the list could go on and on. So in a very brief way, any history is a story. History is a narrative constructed by people who want to construct this narrative. And I'm as somebody who graduated from high school at years of perestroika, in my class, we had canceled exam in the history because they didn't know what history to ask about. This was the time when they told us about the famine in Ukraine, Stalin's repressions, and the scope and the scale of revelations was so that education system couldn't cope with the reframing, the society couldn't cope. So instead of history exam, we had a history conversation where we discussed where we are going from this point in our society. So if you look sort of back into some of the key posts of Ukraine's statehood, and I'm talking about statehood through the centuries, of course, one of the points of departure is always the Kyiv Rus, but it is one of the controversial points of departure because the Russian Federation, as well as Belarus, who also sort of came as the statehoods of those states came from that narrative. They all claim that sort of, it's our story. Let's move a little bit further in centuries. And I just want to bring to your attention that one of the first democratic experiments in Europe happened actually in Ukraine, in the middle flow of the Dnieper River, where in late medieval centuries, we're talking 15th, 16th, 17th century, Ukrainian Cossacks had a military republic where the leaders were elected hetmans, they were called hetmans, where there were no aristocracy. That particular republic was an interesting experiment. It didn't live long. Catherine the Great smashed it after Russia took control of the territory. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire, became independent. Finland, which was part of the Russian Empire, became independent. Ukraine tried. It had a independent state between 1917 and 20, but it didn't withstand the Bolshevik attack, and Ukraine stopped being independent. So we have these narratives, but we also have to remember that Ukraine's geopolitical position is so that it is between big empires all the time, which means that in the history of Ukraine, if we look at Peter the Great fighting Swedes, he was fighting them in Ukraine, and Ukrainian Cossacks were fighting on both sides of the armies, supporting Peter the Great, supporting the Swedish king. If you look at World War I, military actions took place on the territory of Ukraine, with some of the provinces being on the side of Austria-Hungary and some of the provinces being on the side of the Russian Empire. And if you look at World War II, Ukraine was fully occupied by the German Nazis, and before the war, there were 41 million people living on the territory of Ukraine. I don't say Ukrainians, people in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. After the war, that was 27 million people. You can do the math yourself. So Ukraine has been torn a lot between, but I can tell you about narratives and history, iconic figures, cultural personalities, and of course, Ukrainian language, which can debunk the myth that Ukraine is not a nation or doesn't have a right to be a nation or people.
I've got another question from the chat about information and what information do we trust. One of the people says that Ukraine was going to invade the Donbass in contravention of the Minsk agreement, and that Ukraine has killed 12,000 Donbass residents since 2014. So Whose information do we trust?
Well, the Donbass war was not initiated by Ukraine. It was initiated by Russia. It's a war by proxy. It's the fourth generation warfare, as we know how it happens. It doesn't have to happen with the help of the actual army crossing the border, but it could happen with the help of the local elements who are entering on the payroll of a different state and introducing dissent. The 12,000 people died. This is sort of the UN number for civilians and soldiers who died in the Donetsk and Lugansk parts of the regions. And if you think about Donetsk before the 2014, one of the most developed regional centers in Ukraine, hosted the European Football Cup, lots of roses, massive industry. What happened to that after the proxy war was started? Very prosperous, rich metallurgical, coal industry, metal industry, destroyed, lots of refugees, both sides, towards Ukraine, towards Russia. This gray zone is not the first gray zone the Russian Federation has created. We can mention Transnistria in Moldova, we could mention Abkhazia in Georgia, the list could go on and on. So this is the technique used by the Russian Federation several times. In this regard, the Donbass war is not different, but you cannot deny that in 2014, Ukrainian army was relatively weak. So in 8 years, lots of changes happened. And at the moment, we have an army in Ukraine which went through military training, and now with the help of the allies, actually can fight back. But I will disagree that this is a Ukrainian war. It was triggered by the Russian Federation in the move attempted before.
Thanks, Natalia. And a question probably for all three of you to talk about. Two questions really. What are NATO's next steps? And a related question, how does this end? How do we avoid driving Putin into a corner and perhaps doing something that the whole world will regret, like using nuclear weapons? Who'd like to start on that? Jim, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, this is in a way an unprecedented situation. And especially this kind of waiving of the nuclear threat from Russia. So it is deeply concerning. I can understand the appeals from Ukraine to establish a no-fly zone, for example. But I can also understand fully why President Biden and others are unwilling to do that, because a no-fly zone does mean intervening directly in the war. So I think NATO is kind of following a very kind of sensitive line, but is being careful now. And if we can assume that Putin doesn't want to start a nuclear war, then hopefully he will see those nuances. I suppose the dangers beyond that are around the question of, say, potential mishaps, a missile going astray, or the question of the degree to which economic sanctions gets viewed as economic warfare, as Medvedev claimed, against Russia, and also particularly whether kind of supplies from the into Western Ukraine are considered by Russia to constitute kind of legitimate targets. So I think those are the kind of areas where there's kind of concern that it's a very kind of sensitive line. Now, one of the panels I took place in, they sort of kind of talked about, well, in the Cold War, you know, there were these proxy wars, and there were kind of rules of engagement. And so there were kind of channels to avoid such crises. But that was the Cold War scenario. And those took some time to establish. And Putin's kind of thrown them out of the window in many ways. And also, in many ways, it's not a proxy war. It's perhaps most comparable to if we look at that kind of scenario, maybe the American support, for example, of fighters against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, but that didn't have such a significant kind of meaning as Putin seems to have put onto, and it's also about regime survival as well, put onto this invasion. So it's kind of more than a proxy war. And as I say, those kind of rules of engagement about kind of fighting proxy wars seem to have sort of gone out of the window a bit. So I just find it very alarming. I really don't want to kind of elaborate on kind of different routes it might take. There is a kind of question on there also about kind of what it means. Does this mean the sort of end of kind of Western hegemony, if you like, or NATO role and so on? The rise of China, maybe with Russia. Just 2 points on that. I don't think it would be. I think it's potentially a kind of new Cold War, as Rob said, without that kind of ideological global element to it, to a certain extent, but kind of authoritarianism against democracy and so on. I was actually mentioning in my lecture, just it's nice doing these things from your office, this book by Mark Mazar, Dark Continent, Europe's History of the 20th Century, his point, and it relates to one of the questions here, that it's Europe that was the dark continent that caused wars and so on in the 20th century. But his argument there is actually kind of, we tend to view it through the kind of Cold War lens of communism against capitalism or whatever, but actually it was this kind of clash between authoritarianism and that form of extreme nationalism against democracy and liberalism that really was the kind of thread that ran through the whole 20th century. And unfortunately, that's through to the 21st century now. So it's not that kind of Cold War that we experienced with that specific ideology, but I think it would be a kind of Cold War, as Rob said. That we could talk about things about China, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Jim. Rob, is there anything you'd like to say about, especially where Poland stands in this? Where does the country see things going from here?
Yes, I'll pick up on what Jim was saying, and I agree with all the points that Jim made. I think that NATO will essentially continue doing what it's doing now. And as Jim mentioned, I do argue that we are already in a new Cold War. And the nature of a Cold War is that you have multifaceted competition with an adversary, and you try and outlast that adversary, but you're also very focused on avoiding the sort of confrontation that leads to nuclear Armageddon. And there's a very strong consciousness of that. And I think Jim picked up on those points in his comments, which is why I think NATO will essentially continue much along the current lines with all kinds of support for Ukraine, short of no-fly zones and actual engagement in direct engagement in the conflict, because I think all bets are off if that occurs. And the risks are certainly there that Putin will take some action that is even more drastic than what he has done to date. And we've had a little bit of the nuclear rhetoric alluded to by Putin, at least once, which is very worrying. In terms of Polish perspectives, I think, as I mentioned earlier, Poland, the government, and I think the majority of Poles, favor the strongest possible action short of risking a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. But in terms of that new Cold War, I think whatever happens in Ukraine, it's going to last for a while and probably will last until there is change in Russia. And I think change in Russia can only come from Russians, which is why I make the point that it's so important to distinguish between those in Russia who oppose Putin and Putin's regime. And he doesn't, although Jim made the good point that I think Vladimir Putin does think he embodies the Russian nation, but the reality is that he doesn't, which is why he's so scared of transparent information within Russia. But I think that new Cold War is going to persist for a while. And in some ways, it had already begun. I remember when I came to Poland in 2017 on one of my earlier visits here, and I visited something called the Central European Policy Agency. And when they went through the sort of work they were doing, they said, every day we have Russian bots attacking us. in the cyber sphere. And of course, Natalia mentioned the grey zone activities of Russia on what is called its near abroad, which it considers Ukraine to be part of. So I think that essentially, I don't see much change in how NATO is going to respond to what is happening in Ukraine. Many are speculating about what sort of end game there will be in Ukraine. Very hard to tell in the midst of the fog of war what that will be. I personally think that there is going to have to be some sort of negotiated settlement that in the short term solves and ends all the killing. It doesn't solve, but it will end all the killing. I don't know when and if that will actually happen, but I think it's the most likely scenario. But following that, I don't think it removes the issues that Putin has raised for not just Ukraine, but for the world, and the sort of challenges to the world, or that Jim outlined as well. So I think the short answer is I don't think much will change on the NATO front, but a lot is going to depend on what happens on the battlefront and what the next steps are. But I think we're in for a rocky road ahead, and that there will be prolonged tension between Russia and democracies as long as Vladimir Putin is in power.
Thanks,
If
Rob.
Philip,
Natalia, yes.
Just very quick addition to this line of questions about NATO and what's next. I'm sure you've heard it, but if not, Ukraine is actually proposing a new initiative, and it's called U24. And this is sort of an addition to security architecture in the world. The idea of it is to create a new security alliance of the countries who are willing to help within 24 hours of attack. And these countries don't have to be NATO. They could be NATO. They could be from any part of the world. And I think it might link to one of the questions about what about Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. If it's a like-minded country and it's willing to step in, that's sort of a Ukrainian innovation to security question. We'll have to watch it because it's part of the negotiations on the negotiations package.
Do you think your parents will ever can expect to go back home?
I think they want to. I don't think mentally they left Ukraine. They're at the moment with my sister in the United States. She flew from United States, met them in Krakow on the border, and she took them to the United States because they had a difficult journey, 70 hours on the border. My dad is a professor who worked until the last day. My mom is a vice principal at school. She worked until the last day before the war. For them, it's sort of unimaginable and unreal and unfair and brutal. But imagine being in the mid-70s and changing your life, leaving your apartment, your wonderful summer house, your friends, and they're starting life afresh. But having said that, 14 universities in Ukraine went back to studies to keep morale of their students up. It's online, Zoom, and Dad is now teaching from the United States, and he donates 100% of his salary to Ukraine. So he's still helping Ukraine, but trying to establish new life in a new place, which happened literally within a week, and they didn't plan it. It's a little bit different from if you plan and you're excited about the move.
Yeah. Thank you. Jim, there's some questions there for you. There's one about if James wants us to define Russia as fascist, what does he make of the role of the Azov battalions in eastern Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, some people, if they'd read anything I'd written before about kind of what happened in 2013, 14, might have been surprised about what I've been saying, which was not that I didn't write about that there were kind of extreme nationalists kind of at the kind of root of Euromaidan and so on, but I think it was neglected a little bit at the time by Western media in the initial stages, and also the fact that people in the East didn't necessarily support the overthrowing of Yanukovych and so on. But the fact is that since then, Ukraine, and especially under Zelensky, has moved far beyond that. If you look at the votes for extreme nationalists, they're very low, and they're not an important influential actor. There was an interesting piece by James Meek, who, again, you may know if you read the London Review of Books in The Guardian this weekend, and it's talking about the links between liberals and nationalists. And the fact is that historically and in times of crisis, there have at times had to be links between liberals and those on the more extreme right who they may not want to associate with, but it's a question of survival of the state, and that includes anybody who can fighting at the time. So I don't think it undermines the idea, but I've in the piece that I wrote for Newsroom, which kind of relates a bit to what Natalia was saying about narratives of history, what I point out is that, okay, Ukraine didn't exist in its current borders exactly before 30 years ago. It's overlapping in terms of culture with Russia and so on, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a separate national identity, and it also doesn't mean that national identity needs to be an exclusive anti-Russian or anti-Jewish or whatever identity. And it isn't. And I think particularly since Euromaidan, that's become clear. And I've read articles on this. I mean, literally, I was going to write an article kind of criticizing a bit this narrative about Ukraine becoming a kind of civic nationalist sort of state. And then I read articles which actually knew what they were talking about, and they'd done surveys and everything. And it was pointing out how Russian speakers were often kind of seeing themselves as Ukrainian citizens, orientating towards Europe. They may still be speaking Russian, but they may be beginning to speak Ukrainian, but they saw themselves as Ukrainian and associate with the Ukrainian state and its choice and what kind of state it is. And that's where it becomes this bigger issue. So yes, there have been nationalist forces there in Ukraine, but I think it's a red herring actually to kind of make that much of a fuss about it. Now, if we're talking about Russia, I would have been unwilling to describe it as fascist until recently, but it's that whole kind of othering against internal others. Anybody who's opposed, so it's that complete control of the media, there's the strong leader, there's gender aspects to that. There's anybody who's opposed or liberal is seen as an enemy of Russia. There's certain symbolisms that come in. So as I say, it doesn't particularly matter if we call it fascist or not, but it's a particular way of doing nationalism, which is on a different scale. And I think we need to understand. I'd like, if I can, just to kind of pick up some of the point about change in Russia. And I read the piece that Rob wrote, and which I thought was really interesting. And I agree. I totally agree. You know, it shouldn't be against Russia. We shouldn't think of Russians necessarily as the enemy. But I think if Putin were to go in whatever way, you'd still end up with a very divided Russia. What's happened is a big polarization. You can't kind of sit on the fence about this in Russia, and it's splitting up families and so on. The amount of opposition to the war is probably higher than comes out in the surveys and so on for obvious reasons. And there probably is majority support, but there is quite a lot of opposition which can't necessarily be expressed. But if Putin was to go, there are very many people who kind of believe that Russia is the big victim in everything, and that Putin was the great leader who kind of stood up to this, and they won't disappear. I was interested in what Natalia was saying about the changes under Gorbachev and different approaches to history. So I had this conversation with my Russian student the other day, who's having a terrible time here. And she was talking about her friend who's Russian in Auckland, and she can't talk with her mother because her mother is pro-Putin, won't call it a war, all of this sort of thing. And we tend to think, right, this is older generation. They watch TV, you know, they grew up in the Soviet time. So I said, how old's your friend? And she said, about mid-20s. So how old's her mum? 50. So she was in her kind of late teens when all those changes happened, when Russia became an independent democratic state. And yet she has this point of view. So I don't want to kind of finish pessimistically like that, but it's going to take a lot of trying to kind of change that mindset. And Rob quite rightly talked about the changes in Germany and Japan after the war, but that was after complete defeat and also occupation, which we can't do. That's not going to happen against Russia, whatever happens. So how do we bring about a more fundamental change? And I can understand the lines of those, presumably in Poland included, who sort of say Russia will never change. I can understand it. I don't agree with it, but bringing about that change is going to be very difficult.
Thanks, Jim. Natalia, you did an interview and stuff with a Russian colleague from Canterbury. Can you talk a bit about what you think how divided Russian people are, what the information flows are?
Yeah.
Because obviously some people are very well connected there, but a lot of people aren't.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rob and with Jim, Rob, that we need to be a little bit more nuanced in treating Russians as one big sort of lump of people. And I agree with Jim that how change will happen. What is interesting for me as a scholar of political communication is to see several levels of complexities in the political communication sphere in Russia. First of all, we know about these big propagandists, top propagandists, a la Solovyov, who have been active not just this year and not even during the 8 years between 2014 and 2022. But if you look back, and in 2009, for example, a wonderful 9-episode movie Liquidation came out about southern Ukraine, Odessa after World War II. Everybody watched it. The former Soviet space watched it. 2009. Great actors, great human. Who was the villain in that movie? That was a Ukrainian fascist from the west of Ukraine. And I remember in 2009 talking to my friends about the flop of an ending of this particular movie. So this is in part replying to Jim's question about the 50-year generation who are now sort of differ from the 50-year generation of people in Ukraine or other post-Soviet space. That's been going for some time. So you can talk about level of propaganda, but at the same time, you could hear propagandists themselves being actually quite gloomy about what's happening in Russia now and sending very controversial messages. Then you see these federal channels with the protester behind was the poster saying no war, Marina Ovsyannikova, and she's been all over the media around the world. And then a set of reports appear saying that it was a fake. I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's a whole series of reports saying that she was actually asked to do it, her husband as a Russia Today high official, that she was quickly whisked out of the country. And this is sort of an insurance for Ernst, who is the director or the chief of TV1, the main federal channel. When things will change, he will say, see, I was supporting the dissident voices in my studio. And then in the next turn, we know that today the colleagues of Marina Ovsyannikova, yesterday in Russia, mentioned that she is a UK spy and they denounced her. So we're back to 1937. That's to Jim's point about internal others, how educated people, journalists, media professionals are saying she's a spy from the UK. She's not our friend. We're signing against her. So the level of fake becoming truth, truth becoming fake. Nothing cannot be taken for granted. So is it a brave act of an individual who can stand and as part of that Russia who can make change? Or is it all just the very several levels of an information operation is there in place to say? I want to attract your attention that a great number of intellectuals, thinking people moved out of Russia, and they're not silent. I can name Gordeev, Bykov, Dolin. These are intellectuals, film critics, literary people who have their channels. With VPN, Russian people can access the channels, and they have incredibly honest conversations and dialogues about where next. Some of them are quite melancholic and sad, some of them are full of hope. But I absolutely agree with Rob that there is a potential and there is a group of thinkers. But I also agree with Jim that at the moment, many commentators are commenting on that polarization within society and what to do with the second half and the civil clash when things change in Russia. That's a big question because there are no easy answers at this point. We need to watch the space.
Rob, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think that Jim and Natalia have made all the points that I would make as well. So I think it's probably better to move on to another question. I agree with both of them.
I think, well, we're getting there in the end, and one of the questions that's come up is, what else can New Zealand and New Zealanders do? We've taken our Prime Minister's taken a particular stance. What else is there for us to do, either as individuals or as a country? Perhaps Natalia, could you start on that?
Well, I probably will start with the words of thanks to New Zealand people and New Zealand government. We know that after COVID, New Zealand needs all the resources to help its own people, and a very generous 6 million humanitarian aid package. It's a very generous support from small New Zealand to faraway Ukraine. Ukraine is not sort of a natural partner for New Zealand. It's not, people don't travel there much, they don't know. So I really wanted to say big thank you. And the fact that the government and the parliament got together behind the Sanctions Act and the refugee decision is also, there's a big political decisions. The United States, for example, is saying lots of words about supporting people from Ukraine and welcoming people from Ukraine, but nothing in the legislation says, this is how we're going to do it. And little New Zealand did it. And I think I just wanted to voice potentially views from Ukrainian community here. There is a lot of gratitude to New Zealand people. So I'll probably pass the baton to Rob and Jim.
Rob, I mean, you're sensing an enormous response from the Polish population. So what is it that New Zealand, far away on the other side of the globe, can do?
Yes, I think the response here is obviously the immediate response of a neighbour. Just on as an aside, when the question of overlapping identities was mentioned between Russians and Ukrainians, there's also the question of overlapping identities between Ukrainians and Poland, and Poles, especially Ukrainians from the western part of Ukraine. And I think the way in which those issues of overlapping identity have been managed and have not led to conflict between Ukraine and Poland is important to note, and of course that's even more so in the current situation, and in a sense that those overlapping identities have become a source of solidarity rather than a source of tension as in the past. But that's the neighbour, and you always have issues with neighbours of various sorts, and in difficult times sometimes the best is brought out in neighbours. But on the question of New Zealand, which is not a neighbour of Ukraine, very distant, as Natalia knows, and there aren't a huge number of Ukrainians in New Zealand, as Natalia also knows. I think that individual New Zealanders, probably the best thing they can do, as well as continuing to encourage the government to offer assistance to Ukraine and continue the kind of stand we've seen united stand we've seen in Parliament on various issues, including autonomous sanctions against Russia, as well as doing those things. I think individual New Zealanders can provide assistance through humanitarian organisations. And it's easy to donate to them. There are Ukrainian ones, there are international ones, there are Polish ones. You just need to go on the web and look around a little, and you can find the choice of what kind of organisation you might want to support, who are trying to respond directly to the humanitarian crisis that we see in Ukraine. And I suspect that that's probably the most useful immediate thing that New Zealanders can do. Thanks,
Rob. Anything to add, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I support that point by Rob, and it is difficult here. I'd say also keep following it, but of course try and not get too downhearted because it's so hard. I know my colleague who worked on Syria and have very deep personal connections. It was so difficult for him, and it is, I think, for all of us who are so closely connected with it. So I can understand the impulse of people to want to switch off. And it's important to be able to do sometimes to do that. But at the same time, don't take the attitude of, you know, it's a faraway thing, or even making a point, New Zealand's a South Pacific state now. We don't want to be, you know, seen as part of an outpost of Britain and so on, or Europe. It's important for those reasons I outlined. It's also important for New Zealand identity. And also it's kind of humanitarian impulses in the past. I mean, Natalia actually mentioned in an email about how this was like, you know, the buses of children coming out of Ukraine, how it was like Poland. Both during the Second World War, but also later, of course. So this matters to everybody everywhere. Now, I suppose one thing I'd like New Zealand to do as a government is keep increasing that refugee quota, but not just for Ukrainians. If you go onto the immigration website and you go onto the bit where it talks about New Zealand's commitments under the Refugee Convention, it goes something like, New Zealand has taken over 35,000 refugees since World War II. And we were seeing like millions coming into Europe during the height of the refugee so-called crisis. And of course, so many hundreds of thousands now, or millions, in fact, from Ukraine. So the scale's different. And one of their arguments is, well, we can't keep increasing that because we don't necessarily have the infrastructure support, etc. Does Poland, does Romania, etc., taking these people? So I really would urge that. But again, as I say, widely, not just for Ukraine, for Afghanis, for example, Syrians, and so on. And that just relates, but at the same time, I would make a point which relates to what Rob said about neighbours. There have been some sort of accusations from leftish liberals, well, not necessarily liberals, but who say, you know, there's racism going on. And certainly there's elements of this in Poland and so on about, you know, we didn't want those kind of refugees, but these refugees are different, particularly when you get the language around these are civilized, educated ones and sort of implicitly white as well. And there's been the odd one in some media reports like that. But as with any discourse analysis, there's the danger that commentators will pick that up and take that as general. And I don't think it has been a general response. But at the same time, it matters that they're neighbours. You would expect more of a response from neighbours. We had similar sort of things with the Bosnian conflict and similar things, including from the UN Secretary General at the time, saying, oh, there's worse conflicts elsewhere. All Europe cares about is, worries about is Bosnia. Well, Bosnia is in Europe. And refugees were going straight across into all the surrounding countries. And that's the case now. So it's not surprising that people are doing that. Plus, there is that identity mix in with it. So I suppose also I've got to plea for New Zealanders to kind of understand the nuance and not, as I say, for people on the left, not to automatically always kind of assume that there's some sort of racism behind this and therefore to sort of assume that we shouldn't kind of respond to what's happening in Ukraine. It doesn't mean any less that we opposed the war in Iraq or that we were appalled and perhaps wanted a stronger response in Syria. But let's take it on what's actually happening at the moment.
Thanks, Jim. Any last words from you, Natalia? You began it. Do you want anything else, any other reflections?
Thank you, Philip. I suppose my words at the end will be dum spiro spero, while I live, I breathe. So it may relate to the question, what will happen to Ukraine? I do hope that the war ends very soon, that Ukraine goes to its borders pre-2014 and the massacre ends and people stop dying on both sides of the conflict. But I'm a realist, and it is very difficult to watch what's happening in my country, to the cities I've been to, and to the people I know. So thank you for your support, and thank you for organizing this webinar, because I think discussing it and bringing more people to understand the complexity of the war is already helping. So this is part of the contribution to what New Zealanders can do.
Thanks very much, Natalia. And thank you to the audience. You've had a lot of interesting questions. We haven't been able to deal with them all in the time available, but the questions, the session will be available on YouTube if you want to go back to the beginning of it. And I'd really like to thank our three panelists tonight. Natalia, Rob, Jim, incredibly valuable, incredibly heartfelt responses, and a special thank you to the man who got up at 5:30 in the morning. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everyone. Good night.